Cathaoirleach. Minister, I want to welcome the bill. I think many of its provisions are very welcome and progressive and really do shine a light on the experience of domestic violence in this country. And hopefully, if we get it through, some of the measures will allow women and children who are affected by domestic violence to navigate through the courts a bit easier, to find protective measures a bit easier, and to achieve some forms of protection from an abuser, and to be able to avail of that protection a bit easier. But while I can honestly say that over the years campaigning on women's rights I would have looked over these reports and been involved in women's refuge, I am still taken aback by the scale and the prevalence of violence against women and domestic violence in general in this society. The SAFE report of 2014 suggests that if you extrapolate of the almost 9,500 women who reported abuse, it would represent between 8 to 12% of the total number of women suffering abuse at the hands of partners in communities all around Ireland. The scale of non-reporting is also very worrying, and they reckon that 79% of all women never disclose serious physical or sexual violence by a partner to anyone. And that is 1 in 4 women experience physical and sexual violence from a male partner. I think that non-reporting scale is quite scary, and I think there are a huge amount of reasons for it. The fundamental one is that most women are led to believe that somehow it is their fault that they're abused, that they asked for it, or indeed they're often sometimes directly told by others, relatives sometimes, but by society through various messages that they've made their bed and now they must lie on it. And the biggest problem that women have or indeed anybody has in an abusive relationship, particularly where children are involved, is that they have nowhere else to go. I have a friend, a very close friend, who recently retired from working with Women's Aid. Over the last 25 years, she spent every day of her working life accompanying mainly women into the courts to help them stand up for themselves and to apply for barring orders. And she retired early because she could no longer bear the increasing prevalence of having to take women through the court process and in the end send them back into the arms of their abusers. And the simple reason for it is the housing crisis and the lack of facilities, of alternative facilities for women, for children in this society. There was a time when groups like, or organisations like SONUS could provide alternative homes for victims of abuse. That's no longer the case. SONUS are now extraordinarily frustrated with the level of inability that they perceive not being able to rehouse victims of abuse, and they a lot of the time include children, not all of the time, but most of the time include children. So there are material conditions prevalent in this society which are feeding into the problem and not allowing us to escape from it. So along with this bill, I think we need to seriously look at the alternative provisions for victims of abuse, and in particular I want to emphasise the provision of alternative housing. The TUSLA report showed that domestic violence services helped to nearly 25,000 victims last year, and Irish women are amongst the least likely in Europe to seek support when suffering from domestic abuse. Last year, Women's Aid reported there were almost 17,000 disclosures against women, and 11,000 of those incidents were emotional abuse. And I think this is a very important part of what we need to achieve with this bill, is to ensure that emotional and coercive abuse becomes a crime, because there are so many ways to scare and to threaten and to manipulate another human being, particularly when the relationship is close and when the relationship involves dependency. It'd be very, very difficult to prove, there's no doubt, but even being able to say that you suffer from emotional, coercive and mental crime would be a major step forward in giving and empowering those who suffer from the abuse. I recognise the progressive elements, but I also want to talk for a little bit about why the scale of it is very pervasive, and why violence, particularly against women, is really something that we cannot get away from in our society. On one level, it's straightforward that if you're in an abusive relationship, you're a woman and you want to escape it, what do? We know that the state isn't in a position to provide alternative support, so it's very difficult to leave your home and access any other sort of accommodation that will provide for you and the needs of your children. So many women have to stay in abusive relationships because of economics, and that's why the prevalence of the violence continues. And during the recession, we saw the previous government using what they called, and what the minister clearly named at the time as the low-hanging fruit. To pick the low-hanging fruit first was to cut into things like the funding for women's aid, the closure of refuges around the country, so that the cuts that ensued from the bank bailout were directed at the most vulnerable. Not just people who suffered from domestic violence, there was many others who suffered cuts, but I'm focusing in on this because of the bill and the discussion we're having. And I'm not sure, maybe you could enlighten us, Minister, as to whether any of the cuts and the low-hanging fruit picking that happened during the crisis has been reinstated, has been brought back into full, and that all of that abuse, that sort of abuse by government directly in a financial way, has ended. And of course the housing crisis I've gone into that a bit, but it really does deny women and deny anybody suffering abuse any sense of independence by not being able to seek another place to live. And again, that I think points to the class nature of many of these issues. I know of women of all ages who've been abused in relationships by very wealthy men, by extraordinarily wealthy men in some cases. I know men who've been abused by other men, extraordinarily wealthy men, in some cases. But by and large, and the statistics bear it out, it is the lower economic classes that suffer the most through the excesses of domestic violence. And it is those who need the access and the support the most and who won't get it. So the impact on the most vulnerable women really has to be taken into account. The recent ad campaign urging people not to turn a blind eye, I think, is important in making us all think about it. And there was one very brave woman who came out and showed her reality of her life on YouTube, and that got millions of hits. That was really good and encouraging, I believe, other victims of domestic abuse to come out. But it's really not enough if we don't put the supports, the funding and the provisions in place to empower women and others to be able to leave abusive relationships. But I do ask the question about the scale, and I want to say that I believe it's part of a systemic nature of sexism in our society, and it's deeply ingrained. It's deeply ingrained in the way we live, the pervasive sexism, the allotted roles of how we're supposed to behave, how we're supposed to work, how we're supposed to think, how we're supposed to slot in to a gender-based society. And I think part of that gives us the answer to why all of this happens. And that sort of gender-based role-playing doesn't just apply to women who are meant to be all feminine and quiet and accepting and say nothing and be loving and make sure everybody's all right and keep the peace and shut your face and don't be too bold about things. Of course, we're seeing that broken by women on a large scale, but that doesn't mean that it isn't pervasive in our society. I believe that it still is, because the society uses women's bodies in particular, but women's nature as well, to sell all sorts of commodities, everything from cars to clothes to drink. Eulogises a woman's body, and a man's to a lesser degree, but also a woman's body, to sell products. And I believe that that has a profoundly damaging impact on our perception of each other as human beings, and really goes to the heart of what alienation from our society is all about. And therefore the behaviour of men and women that allows them to put themselves into these gender roles is very much determined by the type of society that we put them into, putting the family at the heart of society. And we all know that Christmas is supposed to be a wonderful experience. It's supposed to be the time of joy and happiness for the family. But we all also know that now, from now on until right after January, there will be a spike and a peak in the levels of domestic abuse and the levels of violence, precisely because families and relationships that are not working are being coerced together with the idea that this is how you should be perceived. The happy, clappy, nuclear family is supposed to be at the heart of who we are and what we are, the norms of every society. And I've no doubt that the recession placed a huge strain on that, and there was evidence going right back at the time. There was studies done in 2011 by Sunnis and others how the recession had placed a huge strain on that sort of happy-clappy image of the family. because when finances are stretched, it is usually the man, on the other hand, who's supposed to play the strong, breadwinning, caregiving role. You know, nobody need worry about anything once the man is there to provide for everybody. It is usually the man who falls foul of that image of self and gets totally frustrated and angry with the society around him. But he doesn't articulate it as, I'm pissed off with society. He articulates it as, I am angry with you and the kids and everything in my life. So all of these things impact, but I do believe we have to question our image of self and the image we pose on women in particular, but both on men as well. Not bringing home the bacon for a man makes him feel worthless, and that should not be the case. And that should not be the sort of pressure that leads to a breakdown in a family and leads to violence, but it does. It hits me at this time of the year, I will say, that the commercial pressure to buy things will really hit and does really impact on families. And I know the moneylenders are probably rubbing their hands at the moment in some of the poorest areas of this city, and that domestic violence will, as I said earlier on, peak around this time of the year. Sounders said in 2010 that almost 3 times more women and children became homeless because of direct domestic violence, and it recorded an astounding 163% increase in the numbers it supported. And that was a result of austerity and the recession and unemployment. And I've no doubt that, you know, it's still true today that that sort of pressure, economic, financial, homelessness, all the rest of it leads and helps to impact on that abuse. But I don't think we can escape from the fact that whether or not you are suffering from financial disempowerment, or indeed on the other end of the scale, financial empowerment, which often makes very wealthy men abusers of their wives as well, I don't think we can escape from the fact that it is very, very prevalent and very deep and very rotten in our society, and that it is true that this bill is setting out to address it by empowering women to be able to report it, to get a barring order easier, to have more say in court. But I just want to add one thing to my experience in dealing with Women's Aid. I think that, and it might be possible to amend the bill if one hasn't already been put in, I think that we should require our judges to undergo further training in not family law, they're very good at that, they know the law to the letter, but family relationships and domestic violence culture. And there is specific training that can be delivered that will help the judges to understand, for example, the need, where requested, to talk to children through video links. Sometimes they reject that as not being their role, they're not social workers. I think we should encourage our judges to take up that training and to look at the cultural impact of domestic violence and not just the legal impact, to give them a more rounded judgment in how they can deliver the necessary protection for women. The protection is not good enough, and I, like many others, would have women coming to me who are so terrified of maybe not a partner who hasn't actually hit them yet, but actually threatens it and keeps them scared and keeps them from being able to express themselves, defend themselves, and otherwise get away from the relationship. Because sometimes what happens with a very twisted human being, their psychology adjusts to understanding, oh, she's getting a bit too snotty, she's getting a bit more power, she's getting a bit too confident, and they up the ante in terms of their own violent and threatening behaviour. So there's a lot needs to be put in place, an awful lot of supports. Having said I welcome the bill, I really do think that this society has to look very, very hard again at the homeless crisis, because we are going to see more women and children driven into homelessness over the happy, clappy period that we're about to enter, precisely because we've nowhere to put them when they suffer from extreme violence at home.
Thank you, Deputy. Still in the first round, Deputy.